Hail thee well, and welcome to D&DIY, a new video series where I am going to be showing you how to make props for your tabletop role-playing game. I had lots of different ideas on the first video to do for this series, but I thought that, we should probably start out simple, and it doesn't get much more simple than aged paper. Seeing as many of the props that I would like to be showing you how to make later on involve using this aged paper, I thought it would be a good idea to show you how to make it yourself so that you could be using it while I'm showing you how to make more complicated projects later on in this video series. So, why would you want to use any of this aged paper in your game? Well, it can be a great way to add some depth to your game, actually, and to your world, in fact. If you hand the players a note via an NPC, it looks much better when it's printed off on this nice parchment-like paper, as opposed to some of your just standard printer paper, like you might be printing it off on. And I think that it adds quite a bit more realism and a little more depth, and it helps to draw the players in a little more if you create this paper and use it whenever you're doing maps or letters or scrolls. You could even write out puzzles and stuff on it, or riddles perhaps, and give them to your players. Like, this is what you see inscribed above the door, and then hand them this parchmenty looking paper that has a riddle written on it. I'm guessing that if you have never thought to do this before, you now are having probably a whole bunch of your own ideas of how you might incorporate this into your game. And that's excellent. I would say that your imagination is your limit when using this resource. Like I said, there have been many other projects that I have done where I have used this paper to further add some of those characteristics to a project to make it look more lifelike, more realistic, more like it actually exists in the world. Before we get too carried away, though, let's start talking about how you would go about aging your paper. Now, there's quite a few different ways to do this, and I will mention some of those at the end of this video. I tend not to prefer any of those methods. I found my own method that I enjoy, which is kind of an adaptation of one that I found online. So I'm going to be taking you through my personal walkthrough to get a nice parchment-looking paper like this. You can see that it has dark edges, and it's very pliable. It's very loose. You see, wherever I want to hold it, that's where it decides it wants to bend, unlike just a normal piece of paper, which you can experiment at home with. I don't have any of that. Oh no, I do. If you look at this right here, and I hold this, kind of on that edge, and kind of like this, you see that it kind of bends and moves slowly, but it's pretty firm, it's rigid. You can hear it as you move it, whereas this, it's a much softer sound, as you can maybe hear. I'm not sure. Another thing that I really like about this aging process is that once the paper is finished, it comes out very soft, and it comes out very pliable, and that means that when you unfold it, after having folded it for quite some time, it lays flat much nicer than just a standard sheet of printer paper would, which I think is also kind of nice, especially if you are printing maps on these, or perhaps you are drawing your own maps after you have finished the aging process, like I prefer to do. And I'm just going to show you a quick example of that. I have one of my parchment papers here, one of the aged ones, and it's just been sitting in a binder for quite some time. I just have a standard hex grid over it, and you can kind of see that over here. And I'm just going to hold it here on my hand, and you can see that even though it's been sitting in my binder, folded up like that, you can still see the creases on the paper pretty noticeably. But it lays very flat in my hand with minimal effort. There's like nothing required. You could try to bend some of those out if you wanted to. Completely unnecessary, though, compared to just your standard printer paper. And I just folded this just a second ago for a demonstration, and I'm just going to pull this out here, and I'm going to just hang it out, and you can see that it just sits on those edges. The first edge that you fold is the one that you have a hard time getting rid of, and it just kind of tilts one way or the other, as you can kind of see here. It just decides that it doesn't want to kind of, yeah. So that's another reason that I kind of like this paper, especially if you're pulling it out very often and you're only pulling it out maybe once a week, but you are looking at it intently during that one time a week. Okay, a couple things before we get into it. I think we're just about ready. I have not figured out how to get my webcam into my kitchen to actually demonstrate the process live action for you, but I am going to be providing you with some detailed pictures over here, and you will be able to watch along with those while I am doing this video, and that'll give you like a general idea of how to do it, what it should kind of look like when you are going through all of these steps. So I hope that that's okay. I know that it's not ideal. I'm going to be trying to, go over the stuff that I can here in front of the camera, but there's only going to be a couple things that I'm able to do that aren't going to be me in the kitchen. So yeah, I hope the pictures are good enough. We'll see. All right. First thing, we need to gather our supplies. What do you need? You need just some standard printer paper, just like this sheet of paper right here that I was demonstrating with earlier. This would do nicely for exactly what we are doing. You can use other types of paper, and there's not going to be much of a difference really. They should, generally, most papers should work for this process. If you have like some heavier weight sketch paper, that also would work very, very nicely. In fact, it works much nicer than this because the sketch paper is heavier weight. It takes a lot more of a beating, and it's a lot more durable. It stands up over time much better than this stuff does. And it's much less likely that you're going to damage the paper during the actual aging process, which is a definite possibility. Next thing you are going to need is something to stain your paper with, and I would recommend either tea or coffee. I prefer very much so coffee. It's much darker, and due to my particular process, a lot of that color comes out in the paper a lot better than tea does. If you are going to use tea, though, I would recommend that you choose the darkest tea that you can find, the blackest of black teas that you can find, and brew that up and then use that instead of coffee when you are doing this. A quick pointer, make sure that whatever you are using to stain your paper is room temperature. Make sure that it is very, very cool, okay? Lukewarm is too warm, especially for this printer paper that we're using. It will disintegrate in anything warmer than lukewarm, or anything warmer than room temperature, essentially. Trust me on that one, guys. I learned it firsthand. Okay, next thing you're going to need is a baking sheet and or some tin foil. The baking sheet is kind of optional. I would highly recommend using both. That's what I do. Baking sheet lined with tin foil around the edges. And make sure that none of those corners have been punctured, and be very gentle with it so that none of your excess moisture leaks onto your baking sheet. Because this stuff can be troublesome to clean off otherwise. So I like to use both. And the last thing that you're going to need is an operational oven, just your standard like kitchen oven that you throw your pizza in, or you bake your pies in, that sort of oven. That's the last thing you need. Pretty much after that, it's just standard stuff. Maybe like a bowl to actually soak your paper in. But we'll get to that. Okay, now that you've gathered your supplies, we can get to the prep work. And this is what I would do if you're like laying down a grid, like a square grid or a hex grid on this paper before you want to do it before the aging process, because it is really difficult to do anything like that. Because I like to trace from templates like this whenever I'm doing my hex grid. But the template, even with the permanent marker, is very difficult to see after the aging process has been done. So do that stuff before you do the aging stuff. And if you're tracing anything, you also want to be doing that during this stage as well. If there's anything in particular that you're like, oh man, I wish I could freehand that, but I can't. I want to just kind of draw it out here, sketch it out, and do that now. But make sure that when you're doing any of this stuff that you are using a waterproof pen that won't run. I typically use like a caliber ballpoint pen, and I don't have it handy, and I tried finding it online and I couldn't. It's not a very special pen. It was pretty cheap. Came in like a 4 or 5 pack or something like that. I found out that it was waterproof because I did a test, and this is what I would recommend that you do. Grab a couple different pens that you have, or a couple different options, maybe pens that you like, and then just scribble on just a blank white piece of paper. And then a really cool test, a really easy way to do this without having to go through the whole thing, is to just then get that sucker really wet, like soaking wet. and then see whether or not the ink runs. Kind of rub your finger over it and see whether or not that ink begins to smear. And if it does, you know that you can't use that pen. So that's what you do if you are going to be tracing out a grid or a hex or grid or anything like that on the paper beforehand. Also, I mean, this actually could work to your effect, to your benefit. Conversely, if you wanted your pen to run, this could also be a good way to find out which of your pens run. Perhaps you wanted like a waterlogged letter to be found by one of the players, and you wanted it to still be legible, but you wanted it to be evident that it had been like soaking in the water for some time. Or perhaps it's a treasure map. Same general principle. Like all the lines are kind of like fuzzy and smeared and blurred, but it's still pretty legible. That would be a really cool effect if you had a pen that was like kind of runny when you got the paper wet. And if you aren't doing any tracing or anything like that, if you aren't applying a grid or doing anything like that, just don't worry about this step. You can just move right on along, and it's very easy to write on the paper even after the aging effect. In fact, it's almost nicer. I feel like the paper is almost more absorbent afterwards, and so it becomes easier to use like a pen and stuff, I believe, on the paper afterwards. But yeah, that's a personal opinion. Okay, so you've applied a grid, or you've traced something on your paper, or you have skipped that step and you are ready to just age some blank paper for just so you can play with it and have some fun with it. First step is to preheat your oven to 180, 185 degrees. I like 185. I mean, you could go lower, like 170. I mean, anywhere in that low or that high 100 range would be is a nice spot to kind of play in. And next thing you want to do is then line your baking sheet with tinfoil. As I said, you can you just line it with the whole baking sheet because you don't want any of that coffee baking onto your tin sheet, or even the tea. I imagine tea would also be kind of troublesome, though probably not as much so. I don't know. I like coffee. Anyway, then if you don't have a baking sheet, you can make like a small basket out of tinfoil. Or if you don't want to use a baking sheet, if it's like a really nice one and you're afraid that the coffee will run, then maybe you just want to use like a bunch of tinfoil. And that's kind of an option too. Maybe you don't have a baking sheet. Maybe you're someone like that. I don't know. But you can just make a little basket out of tinfoil. And if you don't have like a baking sheet with lined edges, this is also something that you're going to want to do, because this is you're going to be applying quite a bit of liquid on this, and it's going to be having a bit of time to bake into the paper, and you want to be sure that none of that liquid goes anywhere except in the paper. And a good way to do that is tinfoil. So you can make a small basket, essentially. A basket, I say. And you just kind of fold the edges a couple times. And again, you want to be careful around the corners to make sure that none of those corners are broken, because you're going to be applying some liquid in there with it. And you also want to make sure that it's big enough for whatever size paper you're using. We're using like 8.5 by 11, and you can keep your paper on hand when you're measuring it out so you have a good idea. Don't worry if it gets crinkled, because we're going to get to that in step 2. When I say don't worry if it gets crinkled, let's be clear, I'm talking about the paper. You don't have to worry if the paper gets crinkled. Worry about the tinfoil. Try to keep that as nice as you can. And again, that is why I would recommend using a baking sheet. But anyway, we are on to step 2, and this is one of the steps I can do here for you. This is where you just take your paper and you crumple it up. I apologize for the noise that this is about to make, by the way. I don't know how audible I'll be over the top of all of the paper crinkling once we kind of get into it. I like to just kind of tighten it up into like a nice little ball, kind of as small and compact as I can get. And then what you do is you kind of carefully, you want to carefully just kind of open it up after you've tightened it up. You can see it was in a small ball like this. Just sits in the hand, and you can open it up now. Oh, maybe. You want to be kind of gentle, unless you want some, like, you know, some tears and some, like, real dramatic effects to your paper. Then, you know, be a little rougher with it when you're uncrumpling it, and it will, you might get some tears around the corners, is typically, or around the edges is where I typically get them. Of course, where else would it begin to tear? I mean, it's probably going to start around the edge. But anyway, after you have crumpled it up, you're like, hey, this looks pretty good. But for Jake's process, this is not quite good enough. And don't worry, it's not too much harder. We're going to crumple it again, but we're not going to use the same procedure. This time, we're going to focus just around the edges, and we're going to try to kind of crumple the edges and the paper around the edges. And again, I apologize for the crinkling paper sound. I'm just trying to make sure this gets nice and folded so you get a good idea of what to work with. And if you see a spot, that looks like it's already pretty well crumpled, you can kind of work over it maybe. You don't have to worry about it so much. You're just looking for like large sections of paper that are uncrumpled, that are just have somehow escaped any crumpling. You want an even crumpling across your paper. And so you want to make sure that you get it like that. And now maybe you'll be able to see it from back here. You can see, even from this distance, quite a bit of texture to this previously plain paper. And even on this camera and with this lighting, it kind of looks slightly aged already. And in fact, that's an easy way to just kind of quickly age some paper, is just to crumple it a few times. That can be a very efficient way if you're short on time. But even still, this aging process does not take very long, if you will continue with me. The next step is you take whatever you are using to stain your coffee. Hereafter referred to as your stainer. And you will pour that in a bowl. Like I said, I like to use coffee, and I'd like to pour that into a bowl. You typically aren't going to need very much. I find that it's like about an ounce or even less than an ounce per sheet of paper to get a very a dark effect on the paper. So you don't need a whole lot, just kind of like a splash. Again, I need to emphasize, make sure that whatever you are using to stain your paper is very cool. Make sure that it is room temperature or colder. I like to use, I actually use cold brew coffee, and so that coffee comes straight out of the fridge whenever I'm using it. I don't have to typically worry about this anymore. But the first few times I was doing this with tea, yes, I learned the hard way that even lukewarm tea will disintegrate your printer paper. Even, you just have to be very careful with this, okay? Make sure that it is very cool when you begin this process. So, what you are going to do is you are going to crumple your paper up, and you are going to slowly press it into the bowl. And you're going to hold it there and kind of apply some pressure for I would say about 4 or 5 seconds. And then you're going to slowly turn it, and you're going to press it into your stainer. Apply some pressure for 4 or 5 seconds, and keep doing that. Do it 2 or 3 times, maybe 4 or 5, and then kind of slowly uncurl it and see what spots, if any, have escaped detection, or not detection, have escaped staining from your stainer. See what any patches are not fully wet with moisture. You want to make sure that the whole page is pretty much sopping wet. And that is, again, why you need to be very careful during this stage. Even using a very cool liquid, this paper is incredibly weak at this point, and you need to be very gentle with it during this whole process. Okay, now we're on to step 3. Now that you have your paper completely soaked in your stainer, and you have slowly made sure that pretty much all of the sections are covered in moisture, you are going to slowly transfer it to your tinfoil lined baking sheet. And you're going to set it in there as gently as you can. And when you are doing this, make sure that you gently pull around the corners to try to straighten it out, because this will make it it's like I said, this paper is very weak, and it can tear without any intention, and so be very gentle and delicate with it. And that's why I would recommend just kind of gently tugging from the corners of the paper to get it stretched out, so that it looks the way that you want it to. I like to avoid a lot of wrinkles in my paper, but if you want to keep those wrinkles in there, that's really cool. That adds another effect to your paper. That's just not typically how I do it, but that's one of the ways that you could experiment with it. That's just entirely up to the user. I would recommend maybe doing it my way once, and then after that you can experiment. Change small variables within the whole process, and you will find that you will get drastically different results. Use a different stainer. Set it for a different amount of time at a different heat. A longer time at a lower heat. Maybe you, like I said, leave some of the crinkles in it, and just kind of play around with it and figure out what kind of different stuff you can get, because you can get, like I said, drastically looking different looking papers from the exact same materials. It's just a difference in preparation. Okay, so you have your paper in your tinfoil lined baking sheet. Now that you have it lined there and it's completely soaked in your staining liquid, you can see that it is completely wet while you have it out there. You now take what little bit you have left in your bowl or your container, whatever you were using to hold the liquid to soak your paper. Now you just take that and you just kind of dribble it over the paper. A little bit here and there, a few drops. Experiment with this. Experiment with everything. But I like to use a good splatter of liquid on top. And then we are then ready, I think, we are then ready to put it in the oven. So the oven should be preheated by now. It's a very low temperature. It should only take a few minutes to get up there. And you just throw it in the oven, and then you set your timer for 20 to 25 minutes. Again, I like to put it in the oven at 185 degrees. And I like to check back after like the first 10 or 15 minutes, I check it every like couple minutes. Because once it hits a certain point, that is when you are going to want to pull it out. You want to pay particular attention to the color at this point. Don't pay attention to the level of moisture on the paper. Once it reaches the right color for your intended use, that is when you should pull it out. And if it is still wet at that point, you just have to wait for it to dry for a bit. You know, you can put it on a rack, you can leave it on the top of the stove, you can do whatever with it, just, let it dry. Or maybe a blow dryer is another good way that you can dry it if you need it very quickly. But you want to wait until it's at the correct color, until you pull it out of the oven. That is going to be the thing that you are watching for. And I find that it is typically in that 20 to 25 minute range. Okay, so your paper has finished baking, you've pulled it out of the oven, it has finished cooling down, and it has finished drying if all of the moisture had not finished drying before you pulled it out of the oven. But you'll notice now, hey, that looks really nice, doesn't it? That's a really nice paper. It's got a really good color. It's got a really, very, very thorough texture. Lots of crumbling and stuff. The stuff that we're looking for. But you'll notice something about it. That's that I'm able to hold it up with one hand here. This paper is incredibly stiff and rigid. This does not at all suit our needs. You see there how unwilling it is to bend. It's even worse than the printer paper before we started crumpling it up. It's like crumpled up paper now. It doesn't want to bend anyway. It actually has some stability because of the crumpling. So this will not do at all. This is when we get to our next step, and this is going to be one of the steps that I'm able to do here for you in front of the camera. Okay, and so here we are with our crumpled aged paper, and as you can see, it's still very much not wanting to. It's not wanting to bend anywhere. It's very stiff and rigid, as I mentioned. And so here's what we're going to do to fix that problem. You can see I've got a little shelf here that I've pulled out. It's got a nice sharp edge on it, nice straight sharp edge. It's nice and smooth. I don't have to worry about anything cutting or tearing my paper here. Now we're going to just slowly try to work it out here. Again, I apologize for the sound that this is going to make. It's probably going to be kind of loud. I think you'll probably be able to hear me though. And you just want to be very slow and gentle. And again, I want to emphasize that you want to do this after you have finished letting it dry, okay? You don't want to try attempting this while there is still any moisture on your paper. And just be nice and slow with it, nice and gentle. As I said, you want to apply some pressure, but you don't want to apply too much pressure. Otherwise, you are going to just tear that sheet in half. One of these little structural, breaks in integrity is going to just cause that paper to tear in your hands, just split across. Again, I learned this firsthand. You can take my word for it. You want to be very gentle during this phase. Maybe I should do that over here so you can get a better idea of what that looks like. That seems like a better idea. And that's okay that I already did the other side, because I like to do this a few times to make sure that you really get it nice and smooth. And you'll see how I noticed that there's a nice big crack here, and so I'm going to try to be very gentle around this area. Try to make sure that the pressure is behind the tear in the paper. As you can see, I'm holding it from up here, not from down here. That would almost ensure that that paper tears. So those are little things you can do to try to keep your paper from tearing. Maybe you want it to tear, though. Maybe that's something that's it's for an effect. But I like it nice and smooth, and you can flip it over and do it a couple times on this side, too. That'll help ensure that both sides have a nice, consistent, smooth, and soft feel to them. Actually, smooth is kind of a poor word choice. It definitely has a nice texture to it. And hey, if you do this yourself, you'll see exactly what I mean when you get to this point. Okay, I think I've bored you with me messing with paper long enough. You can see now that it is very, very soft. It just falls wherever you want it to. And this is what we're looking for. This will make it nice for maps, you know, that you fold it up and you pack it away for a while. And you don't see it for, like I said, you know, for a whole week. Well, hey, when you pull that sucker out again, I'm even going to run my fingernail across it here, around those folds, just to show you what I mean. Even when you really try to make those folds evident, I will fold this out here, and you can see very easily it just sits down. Look at that. Isn't that beautiful? That is nothing like our printer paper from earlier in the video. Okay, and now that we've done some work to kind of work out those crumples and that rigidity in our paper, we have some nice paper now. We have some really soft, parchmenty-like paper, don't we? It's very soft, it's very pliable. It has, like that, I said, that nice soft sound when you crumple it. Isn't that wonderful? I love that. I should print my character sheets on this. That would be fantastic. There's an idea for you. That's another use. You could print your character sheet on some printer paper before this whole step, this whole phase, and then you could go through this aging process with it. The only downside on that particular instance would be that this paper, because it's kind of darker, the pencil that people are typically using can be, it doesn't show up nearly as well. That's why whenever I'm doing my grids or any kind of, any information on the map, I do that in pen. I can do it in pencil and then trace it over in pen, and that's typically what I end up doing. But the pencil, because the pencil is almost illegible otherwise. But I mean, now that you have your paper, you can use it for almost anything. There's plenty of examples. I've shown you a bunch of different styles of maps that I use it for, but you could use it, like I said, for letters or for other props. And there's just all kinds of crazy stuff. I'm actually working on a prop now that I'm going to be using. It's not really a prop. It's actually just a special little thing for me. I'm using it from, I mentioned those index stat card books earlier in another video, and I took the cover of one of those books and I took it off the rest of it, and I wrapped some of this paper around the outside of the cover, and then I just kind of glued it to that. And I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I'm hoping that it looks really cool, and I'm hoping that I will then be able to write something or draw something on the cover of that little stat book. And I think it'll look really cool once I'm done. I don't know. That'll be, perhaps I'll show you how to do something like that in another video. But I wanted to make sure that you could have access to this information so that you at least were able to experiment with this paper yourself. Find a technique that you liked maybe. And I'm going to go over a few different styles actually right now. This isn't the only way that you can do it. This is just the way that I like to do it, because I like the feel and the color and everything about this paper pretty much. So this is what I like, but maybe you'll find something that you like better. Some other things that you can do. You can get it wet with lemon juice. If you want like a specific aging effect, you want it to look like it was burned or something like that, you can soak a portion of the paper in lemon juice, and then you can do the exact same thing. You could probably throw it in the oven and then bake it for a while. Or if you wanted a more dramatic effect, a more immediate and dramatic effect, maybe you want a note that looks like it was someone was trying to burn it, but then they left before it had been completely consumed. You can use this lemon juice method, and then you once you get the portions that you want to look charred, soaked in lemon juice, you just run that over like a flame from a lighter or from your stove or something like that, and you can see some very dramatic effects very quickly that from the acidity in the lemon juice rapidly aging the paper. That's kind of what's happening there in very non-scientific terms. Another thing you could do, you could bury your paper in the backyard perhaps, or anywhere really. I mean, wherever you can have anywhere to bury something. You just dig a shallow little hole and you just throw your crumpled up paper in there, you know, maximize the surface area with the dirt and stuff, and then you just kind of toss some dirt over it again, and you come back for it in maybe a few weeks or so. And that can also create a very realistic aging effect. I have never done this myself though, because it takes too long, and living in Montana, so much of the year the ground is so hard to dig anyway. So I tend not to avoid this. I tend to prefer my method, because my method is actually incredibly quick. Start to finish, I would say that it probably only takes maybe half an hour, and that's if you don't have anything that you need to write on the paper beforehand. If you need to do that stuff beforehand, then that takes however long it takes. But, I mean, I've demonstrated this hex grid that I've been showing on my maps. This actually is pretty quick. With this template that I have, it's very fast to lay that paper over the top of it, and then just quickly draw those lines out, but right before I throw it in the oven, essentially. So, that's something that you can do as well. It's just so fast. That's why I like it. It takes about half an hour per sheet of paper, and it only takes a little bit of stainer to do this. If you made a pot of coffee and you had a day off, you could just make sheets of aged paper all day, and it would, I mean, like I said, 20 minutes, half an hour a sheet. You could pump through a whole bunch of these in a whole day. You could get a whole bunch of this stuff prepared. That would be pretty cool. And that's actually kind of what I end up doing. I typically will make several sheets at a time when I'm sitting down to do this, because I feel like it's more efficient that way. And that way I have, paper ready, for maps. I have a couple hex grids ready to go for when the players travel off of the hex grid that they're currently on. And then I have spare paper that I can use for notes and stuff like that. If there's letters that I need to write out, or secret notes that I need to pass to the player characters because they succeeded on very interesting skill checks that, perhaps that information changes the course of the game, and it's very valuable information, and maybe those players don't want to share it right away. So you write it on a piece of this nice, soft-aged paper and hand it to them, and they're like, ooh, wow, that's cool, whoa, what is this? How long has he had this ready? And you're like, I don't know, like 20 seconds, I just tore off a piece, like literally tore off a piece of it, and then just scribbled something on it, and then handed it to you. That's as easy as it is. Okay, so that should be just about everything. I think I have armed you with all of the information you need to create your own super cool, authentically looking aged paper. I hope that you enjoyed this, and I hope that I will be making many more of these D&DIY videos. I don't know how regularly I will be posting these videos. I think that they will probably take a little bit more time to prepare and edit and those sort of things before I'm able to post them. So I'm not able to guarantee every week. I would like to do every week at some point, but my schedule doesn't really allow it. So for the moment, these D&DIY videos are going to replace the Dungeon Master Masterclass videos whenever I have one to post, essentially. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and I certainly hope that I'm going to see you all again very soon. Thank you all for coming by.